Hello, welcome back to the News Hour. More then on today's extraordinary testimony from the Prime Minister's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, about the government's handling of the pandemic. Dominic Cummings accused Boris Johnson of being unfit for office and told MPs that ministers, officials and advisers had fallen disastrously short in their response to the pandemic and that tens of thousands of people had died needlessly. Let's get plenty of analysis now. We're joined by Lauren McEvatt, former Conservative Special Advisor who worked with Dominic Cummings in government. Also with us, Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer and former Senior Policy Advisor to Labour. And also joining us, Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP and Chair of the Defence Select Committee. Goodness, where do we start? Perhaps Lauren McEvatt, you've been close, would you say, to Dominic Cummings. I guess we expected him to sort of fire a few shots, but did we expect anything like that?
I think close is probably pushing it. We were colleagues when I was a special advisor in the government, but I would not argue we were close when we were colleagues. I think there was a great deal of inevitability to his testimony today, particularly in relation to how personal he got with the people that he very clearly dislikes quite profoundly. And in fact, it was so personal that one could question why on earth he was working for them to begin with. There were some portions of what Dom said today that are important to take away. For example, his assessment of the Cabinet Office being terrifyingly terrible. Obviously, I'm using more PG language since we're pre-Watershed. But this is something that does need to be looked into, because I think that any inquiry that comes now, which we should have one in the next 12 months or so starting, will have to look into how the system and how the status of the apparatus of government and the apparatus of the state functioned under such extraordinary circumstances. But I do think that it is right that he apologised, finally, having gone through an entire press conference about this time last year in which he did not apologise for some truly atrocious judgment in public office. But I also think that he has overlooked criticism from predecessors in office. So he levelled a lot of criticism at Matthew Hancock, the current health secretary. He did not level an awful lot of criticism at Jeremy Hunt, who is, of course, the former health secretary who ran a fairly woeful pandemic preparedness exercise 2 years ago, which was supposed to be the guidebook for a government encountering a pandemic on its doorstep. And with that document being so inadequate, there is very little the government can have done to prepare itself well for what came.
Well, let's get some more reaction to that in a moment. In the meantime, you mentioned about the inquiry there. Let us just hear a little of what Dominic Cummings had to say about the public inquiry that we know is not going to start until at least the spring of 2022. Let's have a listen in.
Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die. There's absolutely no excuse for delaying that, because a lot of the reasons for why that happened are still in place now. Look at the whole debate about variants and whatnot. This has to be honestly explained. If number 10 today won't tell the truth about the official plan, which they briefed the media about and described on TV a year ago, what on earth else is going on in there?
So, Tobias Ellwood, let's come to you. Good evening. He's got a point, hasn't he, Dominic Cummings? Tens of thousands of people died needlessly. They didn't have to.
Well, he was part of the decision-making structure. It was quite interesting hearing him speak today. And we need to separate the score settling from the wider evidence that absolutely we can learn from. Can I just congratulate my committee chairs, Greg Clark and Jeremy Hunt, who did a great job. From a biosecurity perspective, we do need to be very conscious of the lessons, because another pandemic could easily take place. My two takeaways I think are similar to Lauren's there. Firstly is a failure to appreciate the pace in which this pandemic ripped right across the world, including Europe. All our modelling was based on SARS, the transmission rate that started in China, but we had less than a dozen cases here in the UK. MERS was very, very similar to that. And the second one was where I agree with Dominic Cummings, although I don't know why he didn't change it, is that we were far too slow in moving to a war-like footing to improve our situational awareness, our decision-making processes, our command, control, our communication as well. We relied on an existing cabinet construct, which, it's tried and tested, but it is risk-averse and very, very siloed indeed. We had cabinet members, all very well-intentioned, but mostly they were poorly equipped and I'm afraid inexperienced to deal with this pandemic of this scale.
Sonia Sodha, a catalogue of failures, says Dominic Cummings. As journalists, I'm sure you'd have been tuned into this 7 hours of evidence, as will some of the public. But it can't be dismissed as just Westminster tittle-tattle, can it? People's lives have been lost during this, and he is saying tens of thousands, Dominic Cummings. So people out there looking at this probably suspected what he's been saying. Well, what do you make of it all?
It's absolutely not just Westminster tattle. And I think, if anything, his account, which is, after all, just the account of one person from behind the scenes over the last 14 months, shows why we need a proper inquiry, as indeed he argued for. And, you know, what came out today, I mean, I think a lot of it was stuff, the broad parameters around government failings over the last 14 months to get a grip on this pandemic that we knew already. But what Dominic Cummings did in his evidence was really fill in some of the details around that. And it really isn't just a question of government preparedness, although obviously that's critical and important, and the fact that the government acted far too late in March with the national lockdown. There were huge failings all the way out throughout this last year that Cummings touched on. So that relates to care homes and the fact that people were released into, patients from hospitals were released into care homes without being tested for COVID, and the fact that led COVID run rampant in care homes. Thousands and thousands of older people lost their lives in care homes. An absolute disgrace. The disgrace and the scandal around PPE. And even more staggeringly, the fact that we learned that coming out of the first lockdown, the Prime Minister's takeaway was not that he should have acted sooner, but that he shouldn't have locked down at all. And then when we get to the autumn, the consensus of scientific opinion was that we needed a circuit breaker lockdown. We needed to act fast to avoid taking longer, more painful action with even greater economic costs and costs for the NHS later. And the scientific consensus was that we needed that. Advisors were telling the Prime Minister that we needed that. The Prime Minister resisted that all the way along until he finally saw that he had to act. But that is why Cummings is right to say that tens of thousands of people needlessly lost their lives. It was down to the terrible decisions of this Prime Minister.
Laura McEvatt, let's bring you in now. I mean, the language he used, lions led by donkeys, talking about scare story, Boris Johnson treating it as a scare story, something tantamount to swine flu. There's plenty of winners, or let's say losers, in what he'd had to say. But specifically, these allegations of lying levelled against Matt Hancock, how damaging will that be to the Health Secretary? We know he's going to speak tomorrow. His team's already come out and said this is not true. But really, he must be wounded.
I think Matthew Hancock is giving evidence off the back of a year in which he's had some mixed results, admittedly, in relation to how many failings there were from the government response last year, particularly around, as Sonia was pointing out, around the decision not to go for a circuit breaker lockdown in around September. And in relation certainly to the care homes issue, which will resonate within the public mind. But I also think that the public will look at the global response, which is, of course, covered as much as the UK response is in a truly global news world now, and say, look, the entire world struggled with this in certain ways. Many governments have performed badly. And now the United Kingdom is a world-leading responder in its vaccination programme. And I do think that that will support Matthew Hancock's reputation going forward. And it will also support the Prime Minister's reputation.
Tobias Ellwood, somebody is lying, aren't they? I mean, is it Matt Hancock? Is it Dominic Cummings? Somebody's not telling the truth or not being clear with the public. And what does Matt Hancock do now? He's wounded. I mean, if he's talking about several times, Dominic Cummings, that he'd asked for him to be fired, and even the Cabinet Secretary at the time called for his dismissal, it's not looking good, is it?
No, I think this is very unfair. It's absolutely important. We all agree there needs to be a full inquiry, and that's when we're going to get to the bottom of perhaps who said what. You know, it's a real privilege to work in the heart of any government, whether it be, Number 10 or indeed the White House, and you will hear and participate in frank discussions that are held in private. And everyone, including the Prime Minister, should be free to ask awkward or even naive questions and speak their minds without fear that they may one day be quoted or indeed misquoted, because that completely diminishes the competence of the Number 10 machine. When it comes to Matt Hancock, it goes back to my point that we didn't move to a warlike footing. You know, we had Brexit, we created a new department for that. Climate change, a new department. We had a risk-averse, siloed construct that didn't move. And there was Matt Hancock running a massive Whitehall department, but also responsible for care homes, responsible for supporting hospitals, responsible for PPE, and responsible for track and trace. And then, of course, they had to answer all these things, the vaccine program too. Finally, we got the vaccine task force set up with Kate Bingham and Nadeem Zahawi. And we should have done that much, much earlier. So, yes, mistakes were made. They put their hands to it. And we should have moved far, far quicker to a more operational and strategic programme.
Should the blame be labelled at the Prime Minister then if we weren't on a war footing quick enough?
Again, you know, important blame, that's not what we're going to do now. We have learnt, and arguably, you know, in the hard way, we didn't move quickly enough. Like I said, we had people who weren't experienced. We should have brought outside people. You know, the one department I would love to see used more is the MOD. They actually train for emergencies. They deal in strategic planning. They, again, were brought in not to the scale that I would like to have seen.
OK, well, let's pause for a moment. And I want to talk about borders, something that Dominic Cummings has had to say about letting people into the country. It's very relevant at the moment. I think we can now listen to what he had to say on allowing arrivals into the UK.
After April, though, it's a completely different story. Once we switch to Plan B, and right, we're going to build, we're going to do test and trace, we're going to do vaccines, we're going to try and stop the second wave, etc., etc. Fundamentally, there was no proper border policy because the Prime Minister never wanted a proper border policy.
Let's come back to Lauren McEvatt. No proper border policy because the Prime Minister didn't want one. I mean, we're talking today about more than 3,000 daily COVID cases, and that's the highest number since mid-April. We've got the India variant, and we're still having to ask questions about the border policy. Should we have just closed down last March?
So I find this argument to be a really interesting one, and that's because last year I was living in Kenya and I was resident in Nairobi for the first 5 months of this particular crisis. And Kenya, of course, did shut its borders. It, in fact, went further and it shut its cities. So no one was allowed in or out of Nairobi or Mombasa. And that was a very harsh mechanism. It obviously created a situation where bilateral negotiations on repatriation flights became important. But I do also think that it was a sensible decision on the part of the Kenyan government to shut their borders and to shut them that early. Now, obviously, we're in a situation where we have a vaccination program and we're staring down the barrel of a very, very harsh border policy that is not keeping pace with the rest of the world in relation to how we must realistically deal with this problem going forward. We cannot shut out the rest of the world forever. So I would argue that, yes, Dominic Cummings is right. There was not enough of a border policy last year, and other parts of the world who did implement one did do this better in the initial stages. But I would also argue that the current border policies are unsustainable, particularly when it comes to Brits who are overseas and who live overseas permanently and do need to come home from time to time.
Sonia Sodha, have we failed because the borders haven't been closed?
Well, I actually agree with Lauren on that very serious mistakes continue to be made. And I think this is why Tobias Ellwood was wrong to argue that the lessons have been learned from what's gone wrong so far. They haven't. Borders policy has been a problem since the beginning. Then we look back to what was going on in India. India tragically suffering the worst global outbreak. You know, way back, we knew this in March, this was becoming apparent. And yet Boris Johnson delayed the decision to put India on the red list for 3 weeks. We know from data that travellers coming in from India brought in the variant of concern from India, and that's helped seed the issues that we're seeing at the moment. So this is why it's so important, as well as looking to a long-term public inquiry, government has not shown actually that it has been learning the lessons as it's gone along. It took 2-3 mistakes around lockdowns and social restrictions to move to a more gradual loosening of social restrictions that we're seeing at the moment, which I'm very glad that we're seeing now, but it should not have taken 3 or 4 bites of the cherry to get that right. And people did undoubtedly lose their lives as a result. On borders policy, we're still getting it wrong. So we're in a global pandemic. It's still a live issue. Vaccine rollout is going really well, but the biggest threat to vaccine rollout is a variant that is more vaccine resistant being brought into the UK. And our borders policy is absolutely nowhere on that. So I really think that this is still a live issue. There's still a lot of evidence that this is a Prime Minister that's completely unfit for office, who's not learned the lessons and who's not taking the decisions that need to be taken to keep us all safe.
A point on which I want to speak to Tobias Ellwood. Deeply personal attacks here from Dominic Cummings today, talking of the Prime Minister being unfit for office, among many personal digs at a number of people. Is the Prime Minister unfit for office? Unfit, as he puts it, to get the UK through the pandemic?
No, I don't agree with any of that at all. And I started off politely by saying, and I'm not one to sort of venture on this. It's not the politics I try and promote. But there was clearly score settling that's taking place. There's a difference of opinion, and Dominic Cummings has used this opportunity today to air those. I don't think it helps the wider debate whatsoever. We need to pluck from this absolutely what we can learn from, what we still need to learn from, because we're far from out the woods. But to use some of the colourful language that he's had today, this Prime Minister has had to deal with an enduring emergency not seen since the Second World War. We've been tested like other nations across the world. Absolutely, mistakes have been made early on. He's apologised for that. But it's the fact that we've learned from those, that we have a vaccine programme that has put us ahead of most countries around the world today.
Lauren McEvatt, will the public be concerned, or... Dominic Cummings, up till now, he's perhaps been seen as a bit of an outsider to the public. His Barnard Castle trip, which he's tried to explain a bit more today why he went. People take him seriously after this?
I think I saw some polling this morning that was covered in one of the morning emails that about 14% of people polled in the United Kingdom trust what Dominic Cummings has to say, which is less than half of what the Prime Minister polls out on the same question. I think that some of the things that he has said today, particularly around care homes, will resonate quite strongly. But I also think that the public take a large pinch of salt with a lot of what he says. A lot of what he says is deeply personal, is very obviously and demonstrably score settling. And I think that the public will have very little time for that element of what he says. And because he has gone so far down that particular route, I do believe that in the eyes of the public, he will be at least moderately discredited in some of the other things that he's saying.
Briefly, Sonia Sodha, what of his testimony today? Is the public going to take Dominic Cummings any more seriously?
Well, I think the most significant aspects of Dominic Cummings' testimony were the aspects where he really confirmed long-held views, really, and suspicions about serious failings at the heart of government. And I personally, I don't think it really matters, what Dominic Cummings, the individual, has to say necessarily about particular individuals. What's important is when you take a step back from this, the evidence that he gave today about very serious failings, and it's not just Dominic Cummings' evidence. We've got, literally what has happened over the last 14 months, other accounts that support some of this. That's what's really serious. And I think that is ultimately what the public will care about. It might not hurt the government and the Prime Minister quite right now, this current moment when vaccine rollout is going well. But, there will come a moment of accountability.
Thank you. I'll have to stop there because we're going to crash off air. Lauren McEvatt, Sonia Sodha and Tobias Ellwood, thank you. And don't forget, we're going to have a special programme at 8 o'clock this evening with all the key moments and analysis from today's testimony.